Hello everyone, this is RaySpace. Recently I've been doing videos on fast interplanetary transfers, trying out various types of fission engines, advanced fission engines from KSP Interstellar to get to other planets around the solar system quicker, but it's possible to do that with just ion engines. Ion engines have very high efficiency, and especially if you use ion engines with liquid hydrogen. The downside to liquid hydrogen is that it's hard to store because it's cryogenic. It gets very little thrust compared to xenon or argon or stuff like that. And unlike the noble gases, it tends to wear down the ion thrusters. So you need to use pulsed inductive thrusters, which will not have the same effect. But it's possible to use hydrogen with those and still stay safe. The good thing about the hydrogen is that it gets 22,000 seconds of ISP. So it's very, very efficient. You can see the 6-digit meter per second delta V that we get out of that. And of course, if you use hydrogen, then you can just use the same propellant for the NTP, the nuclear thermal propulsion engine, which is what I'm slapping on right now. I've got a big Timberwind there. And of course, it's not going to get the same efficiency as the ion engines, but it gets enough to give us an initial boost out so that we can then use the ion engines for the rest. Now, I'm not going to use the reactor on the NTP to run the ion engines. I've got two separate reactors off to the side, so in theory we would shut down the nuclear thermal propulsion engine and use the smaller reactors. Otherwise, we would need much larger radiators, and overall it'd be more dangerous to have such a powerful reactor still active. So we have the radiators for the reactors involved and a bunch of hydrogen tanks, and I aim to get to Mars quickly with this setup. But honestly, eventually I find out that it's probably better to go practically anywhere else. Well, no, definitely not the inner planets, Mercury and Venus. The problem is the ion engine. Remember, the hydrogen has very, very low thrust. So it takes a long time to do the burns, and it's too long to get to Mercury or Venus, and it's not really great for Mars either. The ideal thing is to use this for the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and so on. And here I do try to aim to go to Mars quickly, initially setting up for maybe a 2-month journey. Ultimately, it's going to take longer because of the length of the burns with the ion engines. But here we are. The front end, the payload, if you will, is 100 tons. And then the dry mass of the propulsion is another 100 tons. So, and then the fuel that we have is about 200 tons, leading to about a 400-ton vessel. Now you can see the 12-year burn time there. It's not really a 12-year burn time because we would be using the NTP with most of the fuel, with 3/4 of the fuel. But still, that's going to be a 3-year burn time with, let's say, 30,000 meters per second, and that's unacceptable because we're trying to get to Mars in 2 months, so we don't have that kind of time. So I slap a whole bunch more of these engines on here and use a slightly souped up version, and so now we have technically 100 ion thrusters at the back, and the burn time right now is saying 2 years. And again, we're not going to be using the ion thrusters with all of that fuel, so it's going to be less than 2 years. And given that, I decided to try it out. So for the fast transfer, 2 months. It takes 10,000 to get out there, but well, the delta V reading is completely incorrect. The NTP can help with about 6,000 of that. And we've got the food, water, and oxygen there. Probably too much food, water, and oxygen for our current crew. But even though the NTP can help us with our initial boost out, it's still got a more than 1 hour burn time, so we have to go around a few times to do this. And so I stop, we cycle around, and start burning again. All the time I'm also using the ion engines. They don't make any difference really with their thrust right now. The problem with doing it this way is, of course, that once we cut out the NTP, which I do once we're on escape, is that we're not really pointed in the right direction for where we wanted to go. If you saw the map, there's a big angular gap, a radial gap between where we were supposed to be going and where we are going right now. Now we have 27,000 meters per second, but ultimately what this means is that we can't get there in 2 months. We need to take a little bit longer, and it ends up being about 4 months to get to Mars, which is better than the normal 6 to 9 months, but not ideal. And it would be much closer to ideal if we were going somewhere else, somewhere further away. But anyway, I do replot, and you'll note that it's taking another 9,000 because with ion engine stuff, no matter how much you do with the NTP, you end up needing basically the full amount that you originally plotted. I mean, it's just like that. I don't know how it manages to always be like that. But the big problem is that we're not doing the burns instantaneously the way they are plotted, which is very close to Earth. We are doing a lot of the burn further away from Earth, and so we don't get the Oberth effect, which is the benefit of being at a high speed while you're doing the burn. That's a whole other topic. I'm sure you can find videos on the Oberth effect somewhere around. But anyway, it doesn't look like we need too much to capture, so that's a positive. But then there's the whole aspect of return, and I'm trying to figure out if I'm gonna have enough for that. And again, on the topic of not being able to do the burns instantaneously, we can't even do this capture burn at Mars in Mars SOI. We need to plan ahead of time, do some of the retro burn outside of Mars SOI before we enter Mars sphere of influence, and then do the rest of the burn. Otherwise, we just don't have enough time. So here I am plotting that part, and of course, because it's being done early, we need to build in a huge radial component into that, which wastes a lot of delta V, and that's why we have the problems that we do. So, but I do this pre-burn, as it were, actually larger than the burn that we're going to do inside Mars SOI, because we just don't have enough time in Mars SOI otherwise. And it leads us to be a little bit further out than I would have liked than I originally plotted, so we have to do a burn towards Mars, which is very costly, but I basically build that in with the burn that we do to capture, so sort of a single deal, and then we do the final bit of capture closer in. Unfortunately, I started it late. It turns out that it took longer than I thought it would, and so I had to light the NTP to actually be able to capture. Otherwise, we would have actually gone on escape, though potentially I would have been able to salvage the situation with the ions. And this ends up being a bad thing, because with the NTP, with the nuclear engine, we only have about 400 meters per second total, and we're using it for about 150. And that's a huge chunk of the delta V that we would have had with the ions. It's about maybe 4,000 meters per second with the ions. So that's bad. And that's going to cause problems for our ability to capture when we get back to Earth. So, yes, I'm telling you right now, we're not going to make it. But here I am plotting the trip back, and initially it doesn't seem like much. In fact, it says it's only 3,300. MechJeb initially gave a 4,172 meter per second estimate, and then told me it was only 3,300. Of course, it's not going to stay 3,300, but it's looking good right there. And that's for a trip that's 4 months. Of course, it's in an interesting place on our orbit, close to apoapsis instead of periapsis, but that's actually to our benefit because we're moving slower at apoapsis, so it's easier to do the ion engine burn more accurately. If the burn was at periapsis, we wouldn't have much time and we'd have to keep going around and around and doing it repeatedly. So this we can basically go straight out on, but it still takes a bit of time because the stage time is still 23 days down there for the 8,000 that we have. And so it's going to take more than 4 days to do 3,000 meters per second. But here I go, and The way it perturbs our orbit, well, it's not the most inaccurate burn I've ever done, but it's obviously off. It's not where we're supposed to be. If you scooch out, it looks a little bit better. But I clearly need to replot, and I let MechJeb do that because we're still in orbit around Mars. It can do that. And the replot actually costs more delta V than the initial. Alright, it was 3,300 initially, now it's 3,600 after we started going out. But, oh well. Here we managed to match a little bit better, and I continue to burn. And this will leave us with about 4,000 meters per second, but I have to do another correction because once we leave Mars SOI, the whole situation resets, and it turns out that I needed more. Not as much as the 2,600 initially plotted, but it ends up being about 2,000, so now we're looking to be down to 3,200. Now, how much will it take to capture at Earth? Well, after I do the burn, so this is the actual result of the correction in interplanetary space after exiting Mars SOI. After doing that and getting it nicely close to Earth, I find out that it's gonna take, well, 2,226 to capture, barely. And we have 2,540. So there's still technically hope, but again, it always costs more with ion engines because we do the burn so far away. I dump food, water, and oxygen, especially when we get closer to Earth, because that will give us a little bit more delta V. But it's really only about another 100 meters per second there. And unfortunately, when I do the pre-burn plot, remember doing a burn before we enter Earth SOI to slow down, the combined pre-burn plus burn at periapsis ends up being about 3,000 instead of 2,750, so now we don't have enough. And to add insult to injury, the game decides to start doing boil off. And, you know, it didn't do boil off before, but I thought we had a good zero boil off situation, but now it is clearly boiling off. We don't have any thrust going, and it just had the hydrogen melt away on us. And so when I did the burn, the pre-burn ahead of time, that left us with only 658 out of 1,400 that we needed to capture. So I wasn't able to capture. But anyway, that is the adventure with the ion engines, and I'll try for the outer planets in the next video. So with that, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.